Sohrab, we're ready.
Okay, great. Welcome to a special edition of Compact Conversations. I'm Sohrab Ahmari, and I'm joined today by my co-founder, Matthew Schmitz, instead of the usual host of this podcast, our colleague and managing editor, Jeff Schulenberger. Instead of him, you'll get me and Matthew, and we are joined by a very special guest, a dear friend of both of ours personally, but also a contributor to podcast, Gladden Pappin, who is the president of the Hungarian Institute of Foreign Affairs. And he'll be discussing an article that he sorry, fix this, Stephen. He'll be discussing his latest article for Compact, how bipolarity spells European doom. And it's not about mental health issues, but rather geopolitical bipolarity, as we'll get into it shortly. But before we do that, Gladden, just very briefly, tell us about your work. What does the Hungarian Institute of Foreign Affairs do, and what do you do there?
Great to be here, Sohrab, and congratulations on all the success at Compact. I'm glad to be a small contributor to the intellectual work there. So the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs is a foreign policy think tank that's attached to the Prime Minister's office in Hungary. So with our staff of 50, we try to track geopolitical events and inform Prime Minister Orbán about them, and also talk about the distinctive and increasingly present Hungarian view on world affairs from our small little spot in Central Europe, where a lot of things and a lot of geopolitical trends always seem to converge.
So I'll ask the first question, and then we'll make this a free-flowing conversation. But just about your essay for us, how a bipolar world spells European doom. Let's talk about just the background, where you lay out, why it is that the United States is increasingly trying to create a kind of pair of bipolar blocks, one led by the United States, the other by China, and why Washington has been trying to do that. You kind of lay out a history going back to the mid-2010s, and why is that a problem for the U.S. and for its European allies?
Well, there are really two issues here that I have been thinking about since 2015 or 2016, and the first is, how did China re-enter the American political imagination as a kind of adversary or a global competitor? It obviously is. So what is the core of that? And then second, how did the world of liberal globalization suddenly come to an end, which it did, I think, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine? So those are the two phenomena that I'm thinking about. And what I remember from 2015 and 2016 was that it was really about deindustrialization in the American heartland. And until that point, American views of China were kind of normal, or had moderately favorable, and we brought them into the WTO and lost a bunch of jobs, but it didn't become a conscious political theme until Trump. And the second thing is that, since the 1990s, everyone believed that global commerce was helping to bring about this liberal, globalized world, and everything had to be oriented toward that. Western companies should operate everywhere. Everyone's going to merge into the Western-driven global corporate sphere. And then suddenly, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, now it's immoral to operate a business in Russia. All the Western businesses should pull out. And basically, we've been going back toward a theme of bloc formation. So those are the things that I've been thinking about, and we can discuss those. The article then is about how this tendency emerges in the American-China relationship, and what the policy options are for the United States as it seeks to compete with China on the global stage. And I think that basically what I argue is that the reindustrialization solution was very hard to materialize. The U.S. didn't really have the political capital, or hasn't thus far had the political capital, to drive a 20-year or even a 10-year major reindustrialization plan. Maybe you can get there, but it's not there yet. So there's been a movement toward thinking about how to counterbalance China primarily militarily. And my argument, which we can get into, but just the simple summary, is that that will be really, really bad for a lot of the third parties from Europe to other small states elsewhere in the world, and and they won't necessarily like or support the consequences of an intense bipolar conflict or 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 competition.
I think one of the objections you hear to kind of mercantilist arguments, we should build up the industrial capacity of states, is that these are generally tied to uh, aggressive foreign policy plans. That basically it's hard to have kind of peacetime mercantilism. That's an argument that free traders uh, tend to make. They associate, as you mentioned uh, in your article, they associate kind of free trade conceits with peace. Do you mention that? Sorry. It, Stephen, cut that at my question out. I can't remember.
He
Sorry,
doesn't. He doesn't in the
okay.
piece, but it's no, no. But it's
Sorry.
an ongoing
But
Gladden theme.
I was just editing this really long Michael Lynn piece, and he mentions that. Sorry.
No, no, but it is an
Stephen,
ongoing Gladden theme.
so-
Yeah.
What's the ongoing line?
That the liberals believe that globalization would also bring about political liberalization.
Right. So that globalization and peace are tied hand in hand. Um, how should people who want a U.S. industrial policy, uh, Stephen? Sorry, let me make the pitch this. Let me ask the question this way: um, how can we encourage an industrial buildup in the U.S. without framing it solely in terms of great power competition?
Well, I think that there are positive and negative ways of the US thinking about its external relationships in order to motivate its national industrial capacity. Even if we look at the Ukraine conflict in the last couple of years, of course, I'm not a supporter of sending tons of arms and materiel to Ukraine, but the conflict has exposed that there's a problem in the heart of the US industrial base. So even from a defense standpoint, I think I would agree with a lot of commentators that the U.S. has to have a stronger industrial base in order to be prepared militarily for the types of conflicts that it would encounter potentially encounter in the 21st century. But the other element of this is that what's happening on the global stage for the last 10 years is that, well, other great powers like China have been competing with the US internationally by offering forms of industrialization, like supporting industrial development in different parts of the world. So the Chinese approach to national industrial development isn't just oriented around preparing for a military conflict in the South China Sea or something, but rather they've been present and active in a lot of the so-called global South, offering industrial projects. Now, that was originally the One Belt, One Road or Belt and Road Initiative. And in the early days of that, there were some maybe kind of shady financing deals, some debt trap instruments and things like that that dented its credibility and popularity. But the point is that the US has had a very minimal like international industrial development program. During the Trump administration, or when Trump came to power, there was a relatively small program called the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. And that was a program whereby the US would help private companies which were engaged in industrial development or kind of material projects outside of the country. Trump actually took this and transformed it into a larger, but still relatively small fund called the Development Finance Corporation, which would again pair with private projects overseas and try to accelerate them or offer good co-financing terms. But still, the U.S. has a hard time thinking in terms of industrial policy for itself, still less in thinking about state-driven projects that would occur outside of its borders. Just to put a point on this, in the case of Hungary, Hungary's been under a lot of pressure from the U.S. ambassador in Hungary, who's very much against the pro-traditional family laws. The U.S. government or Biden administration recently canceled the tax treaty between the U.S. and Hungary. China is very active in Hungary, They build things, they invest. So Hungary is not the only country which is sometimes caught in this situation where the US is putting ideological pressure or kind of trading on its or following an ideology first foreign policy, whereas other international partners are just offering investment or practical cooperation. So what I'm saying is I've gone on too long in my answer to the question, but the U.S. can think about industrialization not just for domestic reasons and not just for preparing for a war, but as a way of positively spreading its material and physical or infrastructural influence internationally.
So that your point about and I've heard this in various ways. There's a kind of clever way that I think at one point J.D. Vance put it, where it's like, China invests in infrastructure, the U.S. lectures you about trans rights, and that's a meaningful distinction. It's a problem for U.S. foreign policy. And speaking of J.D. Vance, I want to get your reaction in terms of whether you think what he's laid out in a piece for the American Conservative, actually laid out this approach for U.S.-China relations, which is neither going back to late 90s, early 2000s style euphoric interdependence and globalization, but nor kind of saber rattling and making a kind of conflict inevitable, but something in the middle, which would involve decoupling or and emphasis on domestic reindustrialization, but short of a military flex.
Yeah, I think that hopefully we can all agree that liberal globalization is over, and the mindset that went along with it, that the whole world would be transformed into liberal democracy just by free trade, and it doesn't matter where everything is made. That's definitely over. And so, what is a national sovereignty-oriented mindset going to pursue? Well, having greater industrial strength is good for any country. So it's something that the U.S. should pursue. I think that it's a complex thing to pursue, and the issue that I'm trying to point to in the compact piece is that as the U.S. thinks more and more about competing with China itself, it has to be careful because a lot of different parts of the world have more open economies than the United States does, are more dependent upon international trade. And so the core of the argument in the piece, just to gesture to that, is that if the U.S. focuses militarily on China and expects Europe and other parts of the world to do a better job of taking care of their own defense, it has to allow them the economic conditions to be able to fulfill that. And so the U.S. is powerful enough to think about some form of decoupling with China. I know there's some, David P. Goldman is fond of saying that, even reindustrializing the U.S. would require, more imports of machine equipment and stuff from China for now. But it's true that like a national sovereignty mindset should be oriented toward, in what ways can we take care of ourselves and make our country strong. But, if a conservative administration comes in, if we have another Trump administration, what I would argue is that a new Trump administration should not be pressuring Europe to decouple from China, should not be pressuring other countries to make decisions that aren't in their national interest, because the result will actually be undermining for American power as well. If Europe can't trade freely and get cheap energy, then it won't be able to keep up its industrial capacity. Without that, it can't defend itself. And if it can't defend itself, then America will be right back having to help again. So basically,
and that would distract from the kind of military pivot to Asia and so on.
Very quickly it would, because I think we've already seen in the Ukraine conflict that the Western view or the American view was we can send a little bit of technology and equipment, and the Ukraine will be able to take care of itself with that. The result has actually been the conflict has become a kind of quagmire of some sort, and in the meantime, we had to requisition arms and material from other American storage places elsewhere in the world, draw down our resources, our military resources elsewhere, and now conflicts are brewing in those places. So the mindset that we developed in the 1990s, where we can direct a little military energy here, a little there, and rapidly restore world peace or whatever, that's clearly not the case. But there are also dangers involved in directing our military energy just in one place. So we should think more about like a positive vision of reindustrialization and focusing on what our national interests are, but having basically a more practical international approach.
Yeah, you're talking, or we're talking here about the economic aspect of this. There's also obviously a kind of direct kind of foreign policy element to this, which you just alluded to, mentioning Ukraine. Um, the government of Hungary has taken a different line than a lot of other Western countries have um, on that conflict. And I wonder if that in some way relates to the economic issues you're discussing here.
Well, the Hungarian approach to the war in Ukraine was from the beginning, well, to denounce the Russian invasion. Hungary has a border with Ukraine, doesn't want any violation of the peace in its neighborhood. But there were two distinctive features of the Hungarian approach, both of which you've alluded to and which I think have turned out to be unfortunately prescient. And the first is that we were very skeptical of the theory that the West could just supply arms and material. And of course, more power to the Ukrainian forces that were putting all of their energy into fighting to defend their country. But we were very skeptical that that would work. We judged that Russia would be able to more quickly transform into a wartime economy, orient its industrial capacity, which it still has, toward that, and basically outlast the will of the West to keep the conflict going forever. Unfortunately, I think that's more or less proved to be the case. Of course, Hungary doesn't ask for or get any credit for being right. We wish that we were wrong, in fact. The economic element that's connected to this is that right at the beginning of the war, the West also said, Russia's a kind of small economy. It's like the size of the Italian economy in terms of GDP. You know what? We can use our standard tools of sanctions to, to finish it off, basically. So all we need to do is apply some sanctions, kick the Russians out of SWIFT, apply energy sanctions, and it'll be great because we can just sell LNG to Europe, we can keep the lights on in Europe, and damage the enemy. Well, that's backfired in a pretty dramatic way. Energy prices went up in Europe. In a lot of European countries, there was been considerable changes of government and political instability result from that. And we've even started to see in the last half a year or so, German industrial capacity is going down. So we talk a lot, Americans talk a lot, particularly in conservative circles. Well, America shouldn't just be the only guarantee of security in Europe. The Europeans should take more care of themselves. Well, again, this sort of gets back to the same argument as my current piece on China, but Europe won't be able to take care of itself if it doesn't have cheap energy, if it can't keep up its industrial capacity. So what we felt in Hungary very rapidly at the beginning of the conflict was that this renewed push in the creation of giant economic blocks, like separating off the eastern part of the Eurasian landmass from the western part, was going to come at a huge economic cost. There were tons of linkages had been built up over time, and trying to pull them all apart would have very severe short and medium term economic consequences. I think, unfortunately, that's proving to be the case. And it's true, we can't go back to the era of, and shouldn't go back to the era of liberal globalization, but we should point to a direction in which countries think about their national interests, try to build up their industry, and yet pragmatically and practically make the international connections and trade connections that are useful for them. And just trying to apply an ideological test to that and say, like, well, there should be free trade among the liberal West. We shouldn't trade at all with the non-liberal East or something like that. This distorted ideological framework, I think, is going to come at a terrible economic and even political cost.
So what you lay out in your piece as the alternative, and the essay, just for our listeners, the essay is headlined "How a Bipolar World Spells European Doom." The approach that you lay out is a kind of pragmatic embrace of multipolarity, that multipolarity is here to stay, and the U.S. can continue to pursue kind of a national interest model, but to do that, it requires greater flexibility and nimbleness, rather than what you kind of lay out as a kind of a geographic / ideological line drawing. This is the good world, this is the bad world. But can you sort of elaborate what an American political actor who's embraced a multipolar approach the way you lay out, what would that practically kind of look like? What would they do that would be different from the current approach, which is pushing everyone toward bipolarity?
Well, I just want to, in answering that, I want to say one thing about these words, bipolarity and multipolarity. And I know that especially the word multipolarity, is used in a lot of different ways. And I'm maybe using it in a slightly different sense from the ordinary one. Normally it means like, well, we're entering a world in which there's not just one great power, there's not just two great powers, but actually there are a lot of different centers of power or something like that. What I would say is like that we're entering a world in which more and more countries are evaluating their partnerships in different levels. There's a military level of partnership, a political level, an economic level, and a cultural level, or something like that. And in a lot of parts of the world, there are countries that want to have a certain set of political arrangements, a certain set of economic connections, a certain set of cultural ones, and military ones. Just to pick one example, South Korea is part of the American military umbrella. Just last year, the US and South Korea signed an extended or enhanced nuclear security arrangement, something like that. Nevertheless, it's a country that is pretty much next door to China, and in spite of this security arrangement, has intense economic cooperation with China. So for America, I think the challenge is, first of all, to try to discuss and describe what sort of world it is that we're entering. There's been precious little discussion of that in the Western world. Most of the discourse continues to be dominated by a liberal internationalist viewpoint, and there's not much discussion even of what international strategies have succeeded or failed, for example, on the sanctions. So I think that the first step is a kind of realization that there are more and more countries that want to have their partnerships competed for in different ways. So the U.S. needs to think about what the best offers are that it has. It's pretty easy to answer what the two main ones are from my standpoint. The U.S. has an extraordinary military capacity, which particularly binds it with Europe, but also with other treaty allies. And it has an enormous international cultural cachet as well. But and there are a lot of countries that, of course, there's huge international trade with the United States. But there are several things that the U.S. and the West have done in the last few years that are causing a lot of countries to, well, think twice or to evaluate this again. The one that comes to mind most of all is the sanctions that have been implemented through the international financial and monetary system. So the expulsion of Russia from SWIFT, the sanctioning of foreign currency reserves, these things that shifted or began to shift the role of the U.S. dollar from just being a kind of international technology to being a tool of geopolitical power. So I think that, in the first place, it's mindset. In the second place, it's making cooperation with the United States something that always makes sense for other parties in terms of their own national interest. In the case of Europe in the last few years, pushing the sanctions regime on Russia damaged and seriously hurt the European economy. This is something that Europe can't even discuss. So we need to have the freedom to discuss the fact that this strategy wasn't helpful for one of our best allies, and we need to make sure that that cooperation occurs in a mutually beneficial way. If the U.S. just relies on its ideological power or like kind of ideological enforcement, then the situation for a lot of countries that enjoy these different types of partnership is going to become more difficult. So it's really about competing in the most effective way in a world in which the U.S. can't just rely on the same forms of power that it always has. So even that I know is a kind of sketchy answer and a little bit rambling, but we're at the beginning of figuring out what the post-Ukraine war world looks like. We're still just in the beginning stages of reinventing or reimagining what a projection of or use of American power looks like in that world. And so this is an important conversation to have.
Well, it's interesting how in both the kind of Ukraine conflict and then in terms of these heightening kind of trade tensions, the Hungarian state seems to be arguing for a kind of course of pragmatism and moderation. And I say it's funny because Hungary is geographically situated between West and East, as they're sometimes conceived. It is historically a nation that's oriented toward the West. Saint Stephen made it part of Latin Christendom, but it borders Slavic lands and has a long political history of interaction with Slavic peoples and others, and so there it stands kind of between West and East geographically. And is there some kind of tradition of Hungarian statecraft or something that kind of stands behind the perspective of the current Hungarian government?
I think there's a deep set of geopolitical reasons and an accumulated practice that go together. I mean, Hungary is a member of NATO, it's a member of the European Union, but of course it's not a great power of the size and scale of the United States. But the reason that we're discussing it, I think, the reason that a lot of people are discussing it is that it's within Europe, it's within the West, and yet it's clearly charting a kind of different course. In foreign affairs, that means that Hungary has experienced in the past what bloc formation looks like. During the Cold War, Hungary was trapped in the Eastern Bloc and cut off from all of its natural trade and exchange, political, economic, and cultural with the West. It had the same experience or a similar experience at earlier points in its history when it was dominated by the Ottoman Empire, for example. It's had basically a long experience dealing with the Near East, with the Russian-speaking world, and with the Germanic world, especially, as it was a part of the Austrian Empire. So in order to maintain its distinctive culture and civilization, it's always tried to keep good exchange with and knowledge of each of those areas. And of course, a similar story that's distinctive could be told about a lot of countries in Central Europe. all the way through Central Asia as well. So this is the elements of it are distinctive to Hungary, I think, are the elements that we've been discussing are distinctive to Hungary, but the phenomenon of countries that have pivotal exchange points between West and East is growing more common. There's been a lot of talk since the beginning of the war in Ukraine of the middle corridor. So these are the countries that are just south of Russia, like Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, etc. As trade routes between Europe and Russia were shut off, there's been more and more trade and traffic flowing through the so-called middle corridor countries, and there have been and are a lot of industrial development schemes oriented toward making trade and transportation routes through the middle corridor more important. This is important for American policy planners as well. All of the countries along that route would think in a kind of, maybe not exactly the same way, but in a similar way. So yeah, this is something that comes from experience, but the pivotal thing, I think, and the strange thing as well, if you look back at the last 30 years, is that after the beginning of the Russian invasion, the world moved very rapidly from kind of blithely believing in a reckless form of liberal globalization to kind of throwing it all away and heading back in the direction of bloc formation without anyone really having a discussion of what the consequences would be. It's sort of something that began to happen reactively and without a public discussion. So actually, I think that these kinds of discussions are becoming more important, and there are a lot of actors in the international space who don't want them to happen because it's easier to shift foreign policy if no one is looking too closely. So I think it's really important that we're conversing about this.
And with that, let me just once again thank our friend Gladden Pappin for joining us for this special episode of Conversations with Compact. You can find Gladden on Twitter at Gladden,
GJ Pappin.
GJ Pappin at GJ Pappin, and please do read his piece. The headline is How a Bipolar World Spells European Doom. And subscribe to Compact so you can read more of our work. Nowadays, for many of our articles that are free, you still have to sign up for it so that you get up on our mailing list. But the best way, if you like our work, is to take out a paid subscription. Right now, new subscribers can just join for $3 a month for the first month. That's just that's a standard for all new subscribers. So go find that deal at compactmag.com. But this article, I should say, is totally free for everyone to read. So thank you, Gladden. And thank you.
Thanks, Gladden.